on its promises of reform, or it has enacted such changes to our bureaucratic structure that have actually made it harder for Pakistan as a state to achieve its objectives in terms of modernization, in terms of development, in terms of social and economic policies. So we have a very interesting thing in Pakistan that we have a very wide ranging and long standing discourse over the issue of reform that goes back to the early 1950s. Now, in this context, when we think about the role of bureaucracy in modernization, we often forget that any bureaucracy is there to serve certain purposes. So the objectives for which a bureaucracy is organized are ultimately objectives that have to be defined in the political sense or in the philosophical sense, which is to say, what is the purpose that we want the bureaucracy to serve? Now, in that context, in Pakistan, as well as in many other countries that emerged from colonial rule, the desire of ruling elites was to modernize their countries and to achieve a kind of industrial transformation on a pattern similar to what was achieved by certain Western countries in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and also on a pattern similar to what was achieved by the Japanese in the early 20th century. So that has been a kind of objective that lots of different governments, including governments in Pakistan and in neighboring India, have had. Now, in our context, we inherited a particular kind of bureaucracy from the British colonial state. This bureaucracy had several aspects, several features that had much to recommend them. So, for example, British India was a civilian led state. It was a state in which the civilian executive had overall control of policy making. At the same time, the elite cadres of the British Indian state, the All India services, were merit-based bureaucracies. They had a high level of professional autonomy, and they were protected from arbitrary interference and changes in their status by members of the political leadership. So there was a lot to recommend them at a certain institutional level. But at the same time, these bureaucracies suffered from basic design flaws. And the design flaw, of course, was that the British imperial state in South Asia was not really interested in bringing about the economic development of the region. So the British colonial bureaucracy, while modern in certain ways, was essentially uninterested in bringing about the industrial transformation of the Indian subcontinent. And this was entirely understandable given that the economic interests of the metropolitan country of England dictated that its overseas colonies should serve certain purposes that would reinforce England's status as a major industrial and financial power, and that the colonies should not compete with England when it came to the manufacture of goods or when it came to the provision of certain complex services related to finance. So, although the British Indian state did encourage a kind of horizontal economic expansion and demographic expansion, it really didn't do very much by way of stimulating industrial development in South Asia. Now, this kind of administration in British India was dominated at all levels, including the local level, the provincial level, and the central level, by a particular cadre of the All India services. And this was, of course, the famous steel frame, the ICS, the Indian Civil Service, that provided the critical role of commissioner in the districts, that also provided the critical role in terms of heading the provincial secretariats, and that also constituted the bureaucratic leadership at the central level. And these Indian civil service officers, if you've ever studied colonial India, you'll know that these were people of outstanding intellectual ability. They wrote voluminously about their experiences in India, and they carried out the land revenue and law and order administration at the local level. And they also played the role of policy advisor and senior executives in the management of the British imperial state. Now, these officials and these services that existed in British India are inherited by both India and by Pakistan. And in Pakistan, soon after independence, a debate emerges that how are we going to reorient our public administration for the purpose of bringing about the desired industrialization and economic transformation of our society. So, this debate is one that begins in the early 1950s, and it is a debate in which different foreign governments, particularly the United States, also get involved in the form of providing Pakistan with advice regarding its overall organization, as especially with regards to its administration. And in the 1950s, the thrust of the advice that is received by the Pakistani government is that it should essentially entrust the task of carrying out the development functions of the government, and it should place the civil service, the CSP as it was then known after independence, in charge of managing the overall development administration, in addition to continuing to perform its traditional roles in terms of the magistracy and the land revenue collection or the supervision thereof. So, this is one angle that emerges. And this, of course, very neatly reinforces the overall domination of the civil service of Pakistan cadre, in that it is now no longer supposed to be simply doing law and order or land revenue collection. It is also now regarded as a kind of development executive. And the Americans, through their advisory group, through their missions over here, they try to reprogram the CSP into a developmental bureaucracy. Now, by the time the early 1960s roll around, Ayub Khan is in power, and Ayub Khan creates a whole bunch of different commissions to look at Pakistan's problems of development and problems of administration. One of these commissions is the 1959 to 1962 Pay and Services Commission, chaired by Justice A.R. Cornelius. Cornelius, of course, was a very famous Pakistani jurist. He wrote the dissenting judgment in the context of the mid-1950s doctrine of necessity. And he was put in charge of this Pay and Services Commission by Ayub Khan. Now, Cornelius, in his report of this Pay and Services Commission, made an argument that was almost completely the opposite of the argument that the Americans were making in the 1950s, and that our own political and then military leadership had also taken on board. Cornelius made the case that the old Indian civil service was, in fact, an efficient instrument in terms of the objectives for which it had been designed, i.e., the maintenance of law and order and the collection of the land revenue. And as such, there was nothing inherently wrong with that service defined in terms of its historic objectives. But the problem was that as we wanted our society to modernize, as we wanted our state to achieve industrial transformation, this meant that we needed to transition from a bureaucracy that was based upon leadership of one particular group within the overall bureaucratic elite, based upon its field administrative functions, to a bureaucracy that would be characterized by a high level of specialization, to a bureaucracy that would be characterized by a high level of respect for the subject knowledge of the officials, and to a bureaucracy that would then be organized in terms of self contained, subject based, or ministerial based services that would have an integration of rotation between field and secretariat assignments, and within which essentially officers would spend their entire career in one particular department and rise to the top of that department, being groomed for that position within their own respective areas of expertise. Cornelius called this an administrative technocracy, and he said that essentially this is the kind of civil service structure Pakistan is going to need if we want to achieve the stated objectives of policy of the government. That is to say, if we want Pakistan to modernize, we need to have a bureaucracy that actually embodies modern knowledge, that actually represents the process of modernization that it is trying to bring about in the rest of the society. Now, Cornelius's Pay and Services Commission, of course, made a lot of specific recommendations. It went into the great detail about what was happening at the district level, about the tremendous amount of distraction that the civil service of Pakistan cadre had to face, as it was also having to do developmental functions in addition to its core functions. It pointed out that the core functions of magistracy and land revenue were not being performed adequately by the civil service because they were too busy running around doing development work, etc., etc. So there were a lot of specific observations as well that went into Cornelius's recommendations. Now, in 1962, Justice Cornelius hands over this report to Ayub Khan, and presumably Ayub Khan, interested in modernizing Pakistan, ought to have then done something about it. But here, Ayub ran into a very, very basic political cum administrative problem. And that political cum administrative problem was that 9 out of 10 of his federal secretaries, 7 out of 10 of his provincial secretaries, and half of his district commissioners all belonged to the CSP cadre. So, in a way, Ayub was enveloped, surrounded on all sides by one particular service that dominated the bureaucratic leadership. And so, faced with the near unanimous opposition of the CSP to these recommendations, Ayub decided to shelve the report. He decided not to act on Cornelius's advice. And instead, he felt that Pakistan would continue trying to use the CSP cadre to deliver quick results in terms of the development that he had in mind for Pakistan. Now, to be fair, the GDP did grow. Pakistan did experience industrial development during this period. It did, in fact, see a rise in productivity, a rise in its per capita incomes, etc., although they were highly uneven. That created other problems down the road. So, for a while at least, it seemed as if this model of using generalist administrators to carry out development was succeeding. But of course, the fact was that beneath the good news that Ayub was getting from his senior civil servants, there was actually a lot of trouble taking place. And this trouble is also also chronicled by Ayub Khan's own internal reports. So, for instance, in 1967, the committee that Ayub Khan constituted to make proposals for the eradication of corruption from the services observed very bluntly that the civil service, the basic Democrats, the development administration, all of these were becoming increasingly corrupt, increasingly wasteful. They were not being effectively supervised, and internal accountability mechanisms were breaking down. And this is, of course, something which came to a head when, in just the following year, Ayub Khan's government was accused of crony capitalism by his opponents. And this crony capitalism was, of course, very much there. It wasn't a fictitious thing. It was a real reflection of the cartelization of Pakistan's economy under Ayub Khan. And this is again something which leads to mass agitation and which leads to the downfall of the Ayub regime. In the eastern wing of the country, of course, it leads to a full blown secessionist movement that succeeds and leads to the independence of Bangladesh. So, the 1950s and 1960s are often portrayed as a kind of golden period in the administration of Pakistan. And in a way, that is not inaccurate. But when we look at the results of that period, the extreme inequality that emerges during the Ayub era, the growth of corruption, the growth of crony capitalism, and then, of course, the alienation of the eastern wing of the country due to the denial of the democratic process, what we see is that Pakistan pays a very high, indeed an irredeemably high price for Ayub's attempt at a modernizing autocracy. Now, after Ayub is overthrown and his successor Yahya Khan's regime ends in the separation of Pakistan and the subsequent turmoil, a new government comes to power, and this is in many ways the first really democratically elected government that Pakistan has. And this is the government of the Pakistan People's Party, led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And this party has campaigned against Ayub on a strong socialist platform, on a strong left wing platform. It has promised to provide food, clothing, and shelter to all Pakistanis as an inherent right. It has also promised to deliver democracy to the people, and it has also promised to punish those people who had exploited the masses during the preceding period of Ayub Khan's dictatorship. So the new regime that takes shape after Ayub Khan has an opportunity to revisit the problem of our bureaucratic organization. But the problem that Pakistan faces is that the Bhutto government is not really interested in using the bureaucracy as an instrument of modernization. Instead, what the Bhutto government does is that it does away with much of the professionalism and much of the integrity of the civil service structure through a variety of reforms, as well as through a variety of other interventions in the bureaucratic process. These include repeated purges of the civil service. They also include the introduction of a lateral entry scheme that allows for thousands of political loyalists to be inducted into the state machinery at various levels, including at higher levels. It arbitrarily nationalizes large sectors of the economy without any planning or any thought. It does away with the 5-year planning process that the Ayub regime had and replaces it with an ad hoc 1-year planning process. This leads to the collapse of private investment. It leads to the overt politicization of the civil service structure. And what we see is that during the reports of the Bhutto government itself, for the first time in Pakistan's history, there is sustained complaint coming in of interference, political interference, in the day-to-day running of the state machinery. So every MNA, every MPA, every member of the cabinet, they want their person appointed in key positions in their district. They want their people installed as the tehsildars and as the SHOs of their respected areas. And this is all documented by the Bhutto regime's own internal correspondence and reports as well. So, what the Bhutto government basically does is that it replaces the colonial hangover of the Ayub era with a drift towards a kind of Sikha Shahi in terms of the internal administration of the country, where every group, every service has its own political affiliations, its own political patrons, and officers are essentially relying on that patronage to get ahead, to outmaneuver each other. And rather than a cohesive bureaucracy with qualities of professionalism or competence, you essentially end up with the mess that we continue to experience to the present day. So, in that sense, the reforms of the Bhutto era effectively turned the clock back on our civil service structure, and they introduce the kind of rampant cronyism and overt corruption and mismanagement that are the hallmarks of Pakistan's public administration today. Now, with this kind of a bureaucracy, which is also being used as a kind of parking place for large numbers of people by way of generating employment, you can't really expect that bureaucracy to deliver any meaningful modernization of the society or the economy. And the Bhutto regime's promises essentially end in failure, they end in frustration, they end in yet another military coup that brings to power General Ziaul Haq. Now, Zia is interesting in the sense that, as far as he is concerned, the way that the bureaucracy has been pulverized under Bhutto suits him quite well. What it basically means is that at a structural level, the civil service is no longer in a position to defy any effort by the military to encroach upon the administration of the country, and that in effect, the civil servants will do as they are told by their new political boss, in this case, General Zia. And this is something that suits not only Zia, but would also suit his later military ruler, General Musharraf, as well, when he takes power in 1999. So the Zia era essentially sees a general neglect of attempts to reform the bureaucracy. There are lots of very good proposals given to General Zia by his senior civil servants on a wide variety of issues, but he is generally not interested in carrying out any meaningful reform of the system. So the Zia era is like the Ayub era, a kind of missed opportunity in which you have a stable government, you have resources pouring in from outside, but the ruler of the day is not really interested in improving the quality of the civil service machinery at his disposal. Now, moving forward, what we again see is that after the Zia regime, and you might say during the Zia regime, a new kind of uh, development or bureaucratic reform discourse starts to emerge. And this is a kind of discourse that is overtly dominated by international financial institutions such as the World Bank, such as the IMF. And it comes as a kind of a part of a package as Pakistan enters into one structural adjustment program after another after 1980. And one component of these programs is typically reform of governance, reform of the bureaucracy, etc. And what these reforms generally, or these reform ideas generally have in common is that they seek to promote the idea of private sector oriented solutions to Pakistan's problems, market oriented solutions to Pakistan's problems. They also end up creating a situation in which much of the thinking and policy making that Pakistani civil servants should be doing on their own is effectively outsourced to the international financial institutions or to other major aid agencies. So, what is interesting is that after the late 1980s, Pakistan's civil servants really stopped thinking about reform. Up till the late 1980s, what you see is that yes, there are people that are repeatedly coming up with reform ideas from Justice Cornelius onwards. And of course, these ideas are being rejected by the political leadership, but they are there. But after the early 90s, late 80s, there is a kind of a hegemonic discourse that takes over what should be something that we ought to be thinking about rationally and in our own terms. Now, behind this change, there is a kind of tinkering that goes on with the system. So, for instance, one of the reforms that the IFI sell us is the idea of a regulatory state. Regulatory state basically is a kind of concept developed in American public administration based upon how the American state evolves. And what they basically argue is that the executive should create a large number of regulatory agencies. And these regulatory agencies will then monitor the various sectors that they are responsible for, etc. So you have a huge growth in the size of the bureaucracy as you have more and more regulatory bodies attached to it. And this, of course, suits the civil servants, but it does not necessarily improve the ability of the government to deliver on its promises, such as they are. So that is essentially where we stand today. That if you look at Pakistan's reform discourse today, the first thing that strikes you is that it is characterized heavily by donor sponsored ideas. It is essentially a donor driven discourse. The second thing is that when we come down to any practical suggestion, there is a lot of inter-services rivalry. So the police and the DMG keep fighting over executive magistracy or no executive magistracy. The provincial services and the central services, they fight over the number of posts that they ought to respectively have. So you have that kind of setup. Then when it comes to the political leadership, to the extent there is any thinking at all, it is short-term thinking. No political leadership is willing to part with, in the short term, its ability to intervene arbitrarily in the affairs of the civil service in exchange for a long term strengthening of that civil service structure. And then, of course, there is a powerful vested interest of senior bureaucrats who are happy with the status quo, and also when the military is in power, of military rulers who generally feel that a strong or effective civil service will naturally diminish the scope of the military's role in the overall state and political economy and administration of the country. And when you put these things together, there again is no real thinking left in terms of the role of bureaucracy in terms of modernization. So, in that context, in Pakistan today, our elites as well as their advisors no longer think of the bureaucracy as an instrument of modernization. They essentially see it as an instrument for elite aggrandizement, and that is the extent to which their interest in the civil service or the civil service structure extends. And this, of course, leaves Pakistan in a very, very difficult position because when we look at the challenges that Pakistan faces, these are challenges which really cannot be met except through effective government intervention, except through sustained government organization and public sector delivery of services to people at a large scale. But over here, we are confronted with not only a poverty in terms of our ability to execute things, but also our sheer poverty in our ability to think about our problems. And on that note, I will stop my intervention. I think my time is almost up so that we can perhaps take some questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very thought-provoking lecture. Sir, I will take the privilege of asking the first question, and then there are people who are writing in the comment box. Sorry about the background noise, everyone. So, sir, I was thinking about this reform discourse in India. And do you see any similarities between the reform discourse in India and the reform discourse in Pakistan? Uh,
Interestingly, many of the problems that Pakistan faces, India also faces. So in India, what we see is that in the first 40 years after independence, there is a huge expansion in the role of the state under Nehruvian socialism. And that expansion does have certain benefits in that it reduces the amount of socioeconomic inequality, but it also imposes a very high cost in terms of corruption and mismanagement. And Nehru essentially opts to use the existing setup with some minor changes as the instrument of various reforms. So, in a way, the Indian political leadership also opts to retain the colonial structure and try to instrument that colonial structure towards doing things that it was previously not engaged in doing. Like in Pakistan, we also see in India a massive increase in the day to day interference in the affairs of the bureaucracy by members of the political leadership. So, for instance, by the mid 1980s, on average, if you were an Indian Administrative Service officer, you would probably spend less than 10 months at any given post before being transferred out. And less than 10% of Indian Administrative Service officers would actually complete a regular tenure of about 3 years in a given posting. This is what Indian civil servants call the transfer raj. In Pakistan, you also have an arbitrary transfer raj. And this, of course, makes it very difficult to monitor what the civil service structure, etc., is actually doing. So, in that sense, the Indians, they try to retain the sort of colonial plus kind of bureaucratic setup and use that setup to deliver industrialization in a socialist framework, and they fail. Pakistan uses a colonial plus style of bureaucratic setup, and we try to deliver industrialization in a market driven framework, and we fail as well. So both India and Pakistan failed to achieve their goal of industrial transformation. And in India, since 1990, since they have relaxed controls a bit and introduced a greater role for the market, what we basically see is a massive spike in inequality. And that spike in inequality has gone hand in hand with continued growth in corruption and mismanagement at the local level, and with continued politicization of the services at the provincial and even at the federal level by members of the executive. So, what is interesting about both India and Pakistan is that both countries have attempted to modernize without really modernizing their bureaucracies, and both have failed, although their paths to failure are somewhat different from each other in terms of who did what first and how.
Right. So,
Thank you.
thank you, sir. The second question is from Tariq Hafiz. And his question is, how would you rate the current crisscross between the call for specialized CSP cadre and the appointment of the men of uniform on key positions? And what are the challenges the service delivery can face in the very scenario?
Asha, the first thing, of course, is that in Pakistan, there is actually no real proposal to establish a professionalized and specialized civil service system. The proposals that do exist involve renaming some things one way or another. They involve making some posts open to some people under certain circumstances. They're a kind of, tinkering with the system that we have at a certain level. So if we were to actually talk about professionalization of the services or specialization of the services, there are some basic points that would go into that professionalization. The first thing is that in a specialized civil service structure, your academic background determines the scope of your recruitment. The second is that your training is rigorous and it is specialized. The third is that there is regular retraining and certification for promotions. The fourth is that officials are posted largely within a single department or division during their careers. The fifth is that good quality public sector education system exists in order to produce competent graduates to fill technical and support positions in 1 through 16. Six, you have an existing subject-based services for the modernization of health, education, infrastructure, IT, social services, etc. You need specialized services for these functions. Then you need a stability or predictability in the personnel management. Then you need insulation from political pressure. And then you need regular internal evaluation and external accountability. Now, when you put all of this together, that's how you actually get a modern bureaucracy. So if you look at, let's say, the Japanese bureaucracy or the German bureaucracy, they are organized around these 10 principles or so. Of course, there are variations from one place to another, but this is how a specialized bureaucracy is built and operated. In our context, there is no such proposal, and our political leaders really don't have any respect for subject expertise. They will happily appoint anybody anywhere given whatever suits them at any particular point in time. And there isn't really very much that any of these rules or these reforms or procedures can do in the face of that kind of an unenlightened political conduct. So, this is a basic problem. So, in Pakistan, there is no real debate about specialization. Yes, Dr. Ishrat Hussain has sort of repackaged his proposals from 2006 and 7 and brought them back before the current government. He's been, our reforms are for the last 20 years. So maybe he'll still be doing reforms in 2040, who knows? But this is essentially our problem in this sense, that we are not actually talking about real specialization because that is perhaps too difficult, too intellectually taxing. It's a lot easier, just to change a few labels and a few procedures here and there and hope that this sort of continues on its own inertial momentum. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Sadiq Farooq, and he asks, do you think of political instability as an important cause of failure in implementing administrative reforms, as every new government tries to scrap all of the previous reforms and comes up with new strategies?
Well, the interesting thing is that greater political competition should actually make reforms more likely to happen, not less likely. So when we look at India, one of the problems that India had was that for the first nearly 40, 50 years of independence, you had one party winning again and again and again and again. And that essentially meant that as long as the party felt confident that it could win, it had no real interest in bringing about reform of the bureaucratic setup. So instability can actually stimulate a movement towards reform, provided that the intellectual space around that reform agenda has not been captured or has not been undermined by foreign donors or internal vested interests, which is admittedly very, very difficult. In Pakistan, the political instability that has taken place, let's say post 1973, has actually not reversed the reforms that Bhutto carried out, because every ruler that has come to power after Bhutto has found that a politicized, a broken kind of civil service suits them. It suits them in terms of allowing them greater space to exercise arbitrary power. And nobody wants to change that. So nobody wants to have a situation in which, the IG can tell the chief minister that, sorry, sir, we can't do this because it's illegal. They want someone whom they can transfer, every day if that is what the chief minister wants. So that is something which has suited everybody who has come to power. So in a way, the Bhutto era reforms, though they were bad reforms that did terrible harm to the country's administration and to its economy, they have suited the short-term interests of our political leaders as well as our military leaders when they happen to be in political power. So those reforms are carried out and they are here to stay, and no one has really been able to reverse them in any meaningful sense of the term. But stability or instability by themselves do not either make or break reform efforts. So in China, what we see is that the political stability of the Communist Party after Mao leads to tremendous reforms in the state machinery. But what we see in neighboring India is that political stability does not lead to comparable reforms in the structure and in the ethos of the public services. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Masood Ahmed has two questions. Sir, should I ask one by one or should I ask both the questions together?
एक ही पूछ ले, one by one.
Okay.
That's easier for me.
Okay, sir. Comparing British ICS with that of today's Pakistan's civil CSS, do you think our country is focusing more on pro-state mind instead of appointing true intelligentsia, which has led to a failure of our CSS structure?
I think the basic problem is that if you have any kind of open competitive exam for filling important positions in a bureaucracy, such as we do and many other countries do, the challenge is to ensure that your best graduates actually take the exam, they attempt the exam, and that the examination process itself is successful in terms of identifying the genuinely talented candidates from the not so talented ones. What we have unfortunately seen in Pakistan is that on the one hand, the quality of the examination carried out by the FPSC has been widely perceived to have fallen over the past several decades. We also have seen in Pakistan that there is now more competition in terms of other employment opportunities that were not there, let's say, in the 1950s or in the 1960s. So the FPSC recruitment process has to compete with a whole bunch of other attractive options, in banks, in telecommunication companies, in NGOs, in international organizations that did not really exist 50 or 60 years ago when this system was at its height. Then, of course, we have not really succeeded in modernizing this system. So it still follows very 19th century practices in terms of its examination, in terms of how it's carried out. It's a very time consuming process. So it takes, I think, a good, year to 18 months for one candidate to complete one cycle of recruitment. And because the exam has so many subjects in it, it's perhaps difficult for that candidate to do anything else during that time. So it has a very high cost in terms of opportunity for any young person to actually sit and attempt it, or to attempt it repeatedly, as the case might be. So there are a lot of problems with how we manage our competitive recruitment. Having said this, there is really no better system for recruiting people to a civil service than through an open competitive examination. And one of the problems that we often have is that people criticize, let's say, the way in which, the poor way in which we have managed our competitive recruitment process, to make an argument against having a competitive recruitment process, and instead picking people up directly from the intelligentsia or whatever, and putting them in important positions. This, of course, in our context, would lead to massive patronage and massive politicization, even more than what you have now. So the FPSC, with all of its many failings, is a kind of a remnant of a state morality in which merit is still regarded as something important, as something inherently valuable. However flawed its definition of merit has become over the years, and however flawed its execution of its recruitment process has also become, in terms of it being increasingly outdated as far as the needs of the current economy and society, etc., is concerned.
All right. Thank you, sir. The second question is, keeping in view Weber's concept of bureaucracy, how far our CSS adheres to his concept?
Well, at one level, it does adhere to his concept in the sense that it embodies an ideal of merit based recruitment. So the CSS itself is something which probably Weber would be quite happy with, as far as the principle of competition and merit is concerned. Of course, there is a difference between the principle of recruitment and what happens after recruitment. So, even if you are recruited on merit, if your subsequent training is going to be inadequate and your subsequent posting is going to be on the basis of connections or favoritism or other such things, and then your subsequent career is going to depend upon the continued patronage of powerful actors, then clearly you have deviated very far from Weber's ideal. And perhaps what has happened in Pakistan is that we have deviated further and further away from it with the passage of time. So today, only in the sense of recruitment, I think we can say that our central superior services embody any kind of Weberian ideal. In other respects, they have deviated from those very substantially.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. So the next question is from Dr. Nida, and she asks, according to you, which one reform still persists in our current scenario as highlighted by Cornelius? And
Sorry, could you
is it does it still need to be addressed?
sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't get it.
Okay, sir. According to you, which one reform still persists in current scenario as highlighted by Cornelius? And uh, does it like which reform still persists, and uh, does it still need to be addressed? Sir, you can just read it. Nida, if you're there, you could
Maybe
read
go
it.
on to another question. I'm not really understanding what that question is getting at.
Okay, right. Okay, the next question is from Asfar. And since inception, Pakistan is imitating one country's institution or another's, that is democracy, and always fail to get result. Why don't we go with our local kinship system? Because kinship is more a force that works in Pakistan than law. So why not reform it and reform it to modern terms?
Actually, now, that's a very interesting problem because one of the major differences, recently there was this democracy report from The Economist that was briefly in our news cycle. And what I found very interesting about that report was that out of the world's top 18 democracies, three are in East Asia: Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And out of the world's most effective authoritarian regimes, those three are also in East Asia: China, Vietnam, and Singapore. Our problem basically is, and this is a very serious problem which Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis share in common, is that unfortunately we do not have an indigenous tradition of high quality statecraft and state building. In our part of the world, the most successful states were imperial states imposed by outsiders from time to time. And when those states would collapse, the region would fragment, it would fall into extended periods of chaos and calamity until somebody else from the outside came along and established some kind of empire of their own. The East Asians have a very high quality indigenous tradition of meritocracy going back nearly 2200 years to the birth of the Chinese Empire. So, in East Asia, whether the state is authoritarian or whether the state is democratic, the rulers and people of that state have a high quality indigenous tradition of statecraft to draw upon. Unfortunately, we don't. What we have is precisely that kinship thing that you have mentioned. But unfortunately, when you combine kinship with caste and tribal affiliations and sectarian affiliations, you basically end up with a situation where no large scale public interested operation can take place because of the nature of these affiliations. So, this is in a way our problem, that our socio-cultural setup, our indigenous fallback position, let's put it this way, is unfortunately not conducive to the development of a modern, successful state. So when we look at Pakistan and when we look at India, what we see is that over the last 40, 50, 60 years, kinship and casteism and tribalism have returned and captured more and more space in the behavior of the state mechanism. And the result is that the state has become more corrupt, more abusive, less responsive, and less efficient at delivering the desired policy outcomes. So, this is a very, very serious problem that we face. And this is a problem for which, arguably, there is no ultimate solution as well, other than trying to consciously modernize by adapting an external template to our situation as best as we can. So, that I think is what we seriously need to think about.
So the next question is from Mohammed Amin, and he asks, how do you see the discourse of the alliance of diverse ethno-religious social backgrounds against the policy of institutional reforms in Pakistan?
I'm not really sure which alliance you are talking about. Uh, to the extent that there is a debate relating to governance, it has more to do with power sharing or decentralization, or creating more provinces or stuff like that, rather than the actual bureaucracy or the organization of the same thing. So I'm not entirely sure which alliance you are referring to.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
thank you, sir. So there are quite a few questions still left, and they need to be addressed. But since we're reaching our, it's end of time for us after 6 o'clock. So I'll
All
just
right.
take one more question, and what I'll do is that I will email rest of the questions to you, and I will also tag the people who have asked the questions. So the last question is from Iram Gul, and I'm so sorry, rest of you whose questions haven't been answered. So Iram Gul asks, China stable government reform bureaucracy, India stable government could not, and Pakistani governments after Bhutto liked politicized one, where the real problem lies. So
I see. Well, I would basically say the real problem lies in our leadership's understanding of what they wanted to achieve, and relating that understanding to the bureaucracy as an instrument of achieving it. So Ayub Khan wanted to industrialize the country. I don't doubt his intentions at all. He, I think, sincerely was a modernizer. But the administrative recipe he chose for bringing about the desired modernization was to use the colonial setup with minor modifications to deliver development. And that did not work out very well at all. It was, in a way, similar to what the Indians did after independence as well. Nehru, etc., he basically kept the colonial civil service structure intact, and arguably that brought him some benefits as well in terms of stability. But it really couldn't deliver the kind of rapid transformation that India needed after independence. So, in that context, when we look at China, what we see is that China's modernization takes place in two phases. The first phase is the radical phase under Mao. And what Mao does is that he uses a lot of brutality as well, and he effectively crushes the traditional elements in Chinese society. And he establishes a totalizing, centralized state in the form of the current Chinese state. After Mao dies and he is eventually replaced by Deng Xiaoping, then realizes that the kind of permanent revolutionary upheaval that Mao had engendered, while useful to the communist parties in some ways, was highly obstructive of the need to develop the country, to modernize it. And what Deng basically does is that he restores the competitive process for recruitment to the civil service. He rebuilds China's universities. He personally takes on the role of China's establishment minister till 1993. And he builds China's civil service structure consciously in light of the need to modernize it. And that is something which then distinguishes China in the 1980s from India in the 1980s, where you have a change of policies, i.e., from socialism to more market based policies, but without the kind of reform of the administrative structure. In China, there is also a shift in the 1980s from socialist to market based policies. But alongside that, there is a rigorous investment in the development of China's civil service structure. So, in that way, what Deng Xiaoping does is that he creates the instrument through which China will sustain its modernizing effort long after Deng himself has given up power. while Indian and Pakistani leaders at different points in their own countries' histories fail to do the same thing. So, if you look at China today, every year China has competitive exams for recruitment to its civil service. I think every year something like 800,000 to 1 million Chinese graduates compete for about 13,000 vacancies in China's central bureaucracy. It is the largest competitive exam ever held in the world. So that's what the Chinese do. But of course, the reason why Deng is perhaps able to do it is that he can draw upon a 2,000-year-old tradition of meritocracy and respect for scholarship and learning in China that goes back to the founding of the Chinese Empire in 200 BC or thereabouts. So there is again an important technical dimension, but there is also a cultural and historical dimension. We can imitate the technical dimension. We can't really imitate the cultural and historical dimension. But in trying to imitate the technical dimension, maybe we can also learn lessons from the experiences of more successful states. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ilhan. And that brings us to the end of our seminar today. I'm so happy that all of you joined, and thank you so much, sir, for giving us time. Those friends whose questions haven't been answered, I have sent you the email address of Dr. Ilhan Niaz. You can write to him directly. And thank you so much. I also have an announcement. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Thomas Bugler. He will present, he will have a seminar on the Railway Islam, and that would be on next Saturday. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.